So in this video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at how we can run Webpack from our Gulp file. So we're also going to put together our Webpack development server, which is a super awesome feature of Webpack that allows everything from live reloading to super quick recompilations. As well as making recompilations all happen in memory, not touching the file system, which even improves the performance even more, and all that fun stuff. So we're basically going to fill out these two tasks and kind of get stuff rolling. So let's start off with the dev task. Now the dev task is simply going to invoke Webpack against our Webpack config. Not super exciting, but let's go ahead and see how we can do it. Fortunately, Webpack has just like Browserify, has a very simple and easy to use Node package that we can just import and work with right away. So I'm going to say Webpack equals require Webpack. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a compiler, a Webpack compiler. That's kind of like a Browserify instance. And that's going to require that we bring in our config. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Webpack config equals require, and then /webpack.config.js. So I'm just importing this module straight, or not .js, it's optional, but whatever. I'm just importing this module straight into our Gulp file. Now I am going to create a function down here. It's going to be called create dev config. And create dev config right now is simply going to say const config equals webpack config dot clone. So remember how in our Webpack config file, we have this .clone function being exported and allows us for multiple copies of our config file to be created within the same process, because we might want to mutate our configuration. We're kind of looking at this as a sort of base config, and maybe we're doing a production build and we want to do something different. Maybe we're doing a watch build and we want something different. So we want to be able to clone it. So my create dev config is simply, for now, going to return the config. But this is where you would put dev only stuff here, basically. So now with that out of the way, we'll open up our dev task. And our dev task, because Webpack doesn't work with streams, we're going to go ahead and get a callback. So remember, you can write a Gulp task that accepts a parameter, and that's going to be the callback, and we invoke the callback when we're done with the task. So if you don't do that, that's a bad thing. So let's go ahead and create our compiler. So I'm going to say const compiler equals Webpack, the Webpack function, which I imported from the Webpack module, and then create dev config. So I'm just creating a Webpack instance, and then I'm passing my config into it. So then to run it, it's actually very straightforward. I simply say compiler.run, and then I pass in a callback. So the callback that I'm going to get is going to get two parameters. It's going to be error and stats. Now for now, I'm just going to say callback. So basically what I'm saying is create the Webpack compiler, tell it to run, and then when it's done and it invokes this callback, invoke the Gulp callback. So now let's hop over into, I'm going to move this out of the way, hop back over into here, and let's run our dev command. So I'm going to say gulp dev. And hit enter, and hopefully we don't get any errors. And we don't, and it completed. But we're not getting any output, so let's go ahead and fix that. So what I'm going to do here is let's go ahead and clear that out and jump into here. I'm simply, before we invoke callback, I'm going to say console log. Well, first of all, I can say if error, if there was an error anywhere, then I want to print that out. So I want to go ahead and say console.error and return, I guess, or whatever. Then what I'm going to do is over here, I'm going to say, after we check for the error, I'm going to say console log stats toString. Now, stats is an object that contains a bunch of information about what was built, but it has this toString method. And this toString method accepts some parameters. So I'm going to open up an object here to configure it, and I'm going to pass in colors equals true, so that we make sure that we get some nice color formatting in our output. So now if I come back here and run it, run gulp dev, we give it a sec, and we get our output. Now, our output is going to be looking a little different than the output that we would get if we ran Webpack directly. And the reason for that is it's printing out stuff from our node modules. So I actually want to tell the, when I print this out to a string, I want to tell Webpack stats that I do not want it to include any of the things from our node modules folders to condense our output a little bit, because we don't really want to, we're not going to run into many errors. Or if we do run into errors, we'll still get those messages. But when we're just working with Webpack, we don't want to deal with looking at what we compiled in our node modules. So I'm going to add another parameter here to the toString, and simply going to be exclude. And right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the default. So if I were to run the Webpack CLI directly, it's using these exact same methods. It's using stats.toString and all that fun stuff, but it has some defaults that it puts in. And I'm just going to provide all those defaults here so we get an output that's identical to the output that we would get from the CLI. So we're doing node modules, Bower components, jam, and components. Come back here, rerun this, and we should get some output that is identical to if we ran it in the command line window, and we do. So that's really it as far as running Node from Gulp, or running Webpack from Gulp. It's very straightforward. It is more flexible. I prefer to do it this way, again, because it allows me to tweak my configuration based off environment. All right, now for the fun part, watching. So there's nothing stopping us from creating a watch task that does the same thing as passing in the -w flag into Webpack, but there is a better way. I was talking about this a little bit earlier, and in regards to the Webpack dev server. So there's actually two dev servers that you can use. They're both pretty much the same code, but there's a standalone Webpack dev server, as well as a middleware that you can plug into a Node application written in Express. And the benefit of using the Webpack dev server is that it supports hot reloading and all that fun stuff, like updating your CSS. But it also is significantly faster than using the watch task. It keeps everything in memory for us and serves it out as its own server. And it's going to take a little bit of configuration and a little bit of work to get going. So I guess let's go ahead and get started. We can invoke the dev server as a command line utility after installing it, or, not surprisingly, we can use it directly from within our Gulp file. And I think that's what we're going to do in this video. So up here, or back here to my command line window, I'm going to npm install webpack dev server save dev. Now this is going to require some interesting things. Basically, all of our assets are going to be coming from the Webpack dev server. So we're going to have to change our files a little bit, our index.html, to point to the Webpack dev server. And then obviously in production, you would perform a production build that actually copies all of your bundles onto the file system. But in the Webpack dev, during development, you would use the Webpack dev server. It is very much worth it. So even if you have a small project, I recommend getting this all set up. So again, we can run it from the command line. I can say node modules bin Webpack dev server and hit enter. And right now, it's not going to. It will work, but it won't work quite well because my my HTTP server is running on port 8080, and the Webpack dev server default is 8080. But at the very least, we see that it did indeed pick up everything for us. It picked up our Webpack configuration. But let's go ahead and actually create it or start it from our Gulp file so that we can change its port. So in my dev watch, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say const config equals create dev config. Then I'm going to, then we would say, something like mutate config here. That would be only configuration changes we make in the context of the dev server. Then I would go ahead and create my compiler. So const compiler equals webpack, passing in config. After we create our compiler, just like what we did before, instead of hitting compiler.run, I'm going to say const dev server, and then I'm going to import that. Now, I haven't imported it yet into the file. I will have to go up to the top and say I'm going to do this capitalized, or it doesn't really matter. I'll do it capitalized. Webpack dev server, because it is a class we're going to be using the new keyword on. I generally prefer classes to have an uppercase. And then I also am preemptively going to say use strict up here. There are some things it's going to complain at if we don't use strict up there, which you should always be using strict anyway. All right, let's scroll back down and let's initialize our dev server. So I'm going to say new Webpack dev server. And the first parameter is going to be the compiler, the Webpack compiler we're going to use, followed by its options. So for its options, I am going to go ahead and say inline is true, and then stats is going to be set to colors equals true, with exclude being set to basically this before. So the stats is literally exactly what we passed into the toString method of the stats object that was returned, and this will just keep our output nice and clean. As always, you can read more about these configuration options in the respective documentation. Anyway, let's go ahead and say devserver.listen, and I'm going to say devserver listen 8081, and then I'm going to pass in localhost as the host, and then I'm going to pass in a callback, and this callback is just going to say console log dev server started. So let's go ahead and see what this does. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my command line window, and I'm going to say gulp dev watch. Just making sure that is indeed the name of this. And it's going to take a second. And now dev server has indeed started. Notice the gulp task does not end because we're doing a watch. After it's started, it's going to perform the first build. Now what's interesting about this is this has nothing to do with this assets folder. In fact, I can go ahead and nuke this assets folder. We are now serving out all of our assets, all of our bundles, everything in Webpack, off of a custom server. It's no longer hitting our file system, it's all in memory, which is one of the benefits of doing this. However, that causes a problem because now we have to reference the server in order to load our bundles. But before we do that, let's take a look at what the dev server looks like if we were to navigate to it in our browser. So if I open localhost 8081, we see the dev server. So we see that it's been started inside of our root project. So we have our public here, and of course this isn't going to work. Because all of our paths are completely wrong. And I can also, so you see it's basically just started an HTTP server in our current directory. I can also load up Webpack dev server here and just type in this custom URL, and it's going to give us a list of all of the assets that were generated. So for example, I can go ahead and open up application.js, and I can see my entire application.js. So this is all being served in memory. Now, another way to grab the files would be just to go to / and then something like contact.js, and we get our contact bundle, and that's how we're going to use it. So I'm going to move this away here, and I'm going to come into my index.html because now this is broken. Our index.html is broken because we're no longer able to load assets application.js. We need to change this to point to the Webpack dev server. So we come over here, and we simply say http / localhost at 8081 application.js. Now with that out of the way, we can come back here and we can refresh. We see that stuff mostly works, but we're actually running into an issue here. Because if I go ahead and pop open one of these things that uses jQuery UI, notice how it's trying to get this path out of it. Localhost 8080 assets and then the asset name. And that's not what we want. We need to tell the URLs that are generated by our loaders to reference the Webpack dev server as well. And the way that we do that is we hop over to this public path and we change it to our http / localhost 8081 /. So that'll then work. But that's going to be a problem because that's not going to work for production builds. I want to leave it as it is, but in the case of our dev server, I want to modify it. So to do that, I'm going to jump down to where we have our gulp task, and I'm going to mutate the configuration. I'm going to say config.output.public path equals http localhost 8081. Now, you would probably want to put this in a configuration file somewhere so you can modify your port numbers depending on or on your system so that you can, maybe have multiple projects going at once that use different Webpack dev servers. I'll leave that up to as an exercise for you guys. But let's go ahead and nuke the dev server and start it again by just doing gulp dev watch. And then come back over here and refresh. Load this up, and look at that. We were now able to load this asset because now that path is now built in to all of the URL loaders. So I think that's really cool. But yeah, so now basically the way that you would switch between a production and development build is simply in your index.html, do you reference this path or do you reference your / assets? And you can just put in whatever templating language you use, say, okay, so if we're in development, use this, if we're in production, use that. And then when you do a production build with this Webpack config, it'll be appropriately placed into the assets folder for you. But yeah, so if I come over here and keep both these windows open, and I come down here to my source scripts application.js and do something like console log stuff, hit Control S, check that out. A rebuild in how long did it take to rebuild? As you can tell me, 144 milliseconds. So as you can see, without any additional configuration, Webpack is very, very, very quick at rebuilding your entire application. So that is lots of fun. Okay, we might not have enough time to do hot module replacement, but I do want to show you guys how the less loader works, because this is going to be super important. Let's go ahead and pull in Bootstrap. I think that'll be fun. Bootstrap 4 is right around the corner, and Bootstrap 4 uses Sass instead of less. So when you install this, all you future people, make sure that you npm install Bootstrap and then do @version caret 300. Oops, let's save that as well. So this will install Bootstrap, the CSS framework. Now the cool thing about, oh, come on. They got rid of 300, so we'll just go ahead and pull down 336. So yeah, don't pull down 4 for this. It's not going to work in this example. So the cool thing about Bootstrap and the way the less loader works is I can actually go ahead and under my node modules Bootstrap, there's a less folder, and inside of this, there's a bootstrap.less. So I can go ahead and say, in my site.less, import bootstrap, or bootstrap / less, bootstrap.less. And that'll import the Bootstrap module. Webpack will locate it, and then it'll reach into the less directory and then grab Bootstrap. And what's cool about this is it's going to pull down the entirety of the Bootstrap library here, but it's also going to let me use all of their variables and all of their mix-ins from within this less. So now if I come back here and do my my Gulp dev watch, hopefully I got all the proper file extensions for those fonts that Bootstrap uses. Let's see here. Ooh, I actually messed this up. When you reference your modules, or modules in node modules with less, you have to prepend it with a tilde. And the reason for that is less itself has its own file resolution algorithm, and this defers it to Webpack's file resolution algorithm. But as you see, check that out. We got a bunch of WAFs, we got TTFs, SVGs. So Bootstrap's fonts got loaded in. And let's use some Bootstrap here. Let's go ahead and say container row. I'm not going to worry about anything else in here. I'll do button, button default, button small, and then a button. Actually, we want this to be, let's say, a button object or button element. And then we could also, just to prove that our fonts are being loaded properly, our additional assets, without having to do any additional work, we can do an icon, which Bootstrap generally recommends doing that. And we'll do glyph icon, followed by glyph icon, I don't know, glass. Now if we come back over here, let's see if Bootstrap got loaded. Refresh, and check that out. So we do have Bootstrap being loaded into our application, and we have that awesome little glass, and we have our styled button. So, yeah, stuff and things. So that's an example of us pulling down a huge library and it just working. And that's the great thing. Generally speaking, when you're working with Webpack and you have the right config, things will just work. And it's just a matter of making the config correct. And the documentation is great, so I definitely recommend you guys checking that out. But let's go ahead and head off this video, and the next video we'll talk about hot module replacement.